This is not the version that the story told, but the version it has tried to hide.
The indigenous people of Spain were incorporated into their ranks after being defeated, and under Hamilcar's brilliant tactical command, this force became virtually invincible, growing rapidly in strength and size. After the Carthaginians took control, Spain saw the emergence of fertile farms one after another, and the endless mountain ranges were transformed into rich mines. Later, the Carthaginians even sent their surplus funds back home to invest in the management of farms in Carthage itself. The wealth they created astonished the Romans who set foot on Spanish soil years later. Unfortunately, in the 9th year of Hamilcar's stay in Spain, he was killed in battle and was unable to fulfill his long-cherished wish of taking revenge on Rome. At this time, Hannibal was only 18 years old, so it was Hamilcar's son-in-law who succeeded him as ruler. Although he was only the son-in-law, he was meticulous in consolidating the foundation laid by his father-in-law, which played an important role in Hannibal's later expedition against Rome. After ruling Spain for 8 years, Hannibal's brother-in-law was killed by one of his own servants, and then the 26-year-old Hannibal succeeded him. In the second year after he took power, he initiated the Second Punic War. At this time it was 218 BC, and many years had passed since the end of the First Punic War. So, what had the Romans been busy with during these years? Many people know that ancient Rome existed for many years, but although it was always called Rome, those years are actually divided into 4 completely different eras. From 753 BC, when Rome was founded, to 509 BC. For those 244 years, Rome was in its monarchical era, and during this time, Rome was just a small tribe. After being ruled by 7 generations of kings, Rome gradually annexed neighboring small tribes, and its population finally began to grow. As a result, the conflict between the commoners and the nobility intensified. In the end, the Romans expelled the 7th king and established a republican system in 510 BC. During the Republican era, Rome continuously expanded outward, and the most famous figure from this period was Julius Caesar, who conquered all of Gaul, which is roughly present-day France. Later, because he concentrated all power in his own hands and continuously suppressed the nobility, he was ultimately assassinated by the Senate in 44 BC. His successor, Octavian, was granted the title of Augustus in 27 BC, marking the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire. Chinese historical records refer to Rome during this period as Daqin. This period lasted only for several decades. Later, due to internal strife and external threats, the Roman Empire was divided into the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire in 395 AD. From then on, Rome gradually entered the Middle Ages, which lasted for 1,000 years. This period was the Dark Ages of Europe. It was not until 1453 AD, when the Ottoman Turkish Empire captured Constantinople and the Eastern Roman Empire fell, that this era came to an end, spanning a total of 206 years. One of the key reasons for its longevity was Rome's openness and its willingness to learn. They did not forcibly require the conquered city-states to adopt the same system as their own, but instead established alliances with them. Even when dealing with allied states that had betrayed them, Rome was able to accept them back after defeating them again. After the end of the First Punic War, although Rome turned most of the city-states in Sicily into its own provinces, it still humbly learned from their culture. The Romans hired them as private tutors and sent their own children to study in Sicily. This humble attitude also made it easier for the conquered people to accept them. In addition, the land in Sicily was more suitable for farming. Not only was the yield high, but the prices were also low, so the already scarce agriculture in Rome quickly lost its competitiveness. It was during this period that Rome began to shift from growing wheat to cultivating grapes and olives. The western regions that accepted provincial rule, Sicily, under the rule of the Roman province, gradually became Rome's grandeur. After the end of the First Punic War, and before the start of the Second Punic War, there was a period of 23 years during which Carthage continued to grow and strengthen, while Rome enjoyed peace for less than 10 years. The doors of the Temple of Janus were opened once again, because war had begun anew. This time, the target was the Greek peninsula, and the cause was the pirates of the Adriatic Sea, who posed a serious threat to the interests of Rome's allies on the Italian peninsula. In the past, it was the kingdom of Epirus that dealt with these pirates, but now that Epirus had declined and the relatively powerful kingdom of Macedon was too preoccupied to handle the matter, it fell to Rome to take action. These pirates were mainly Illyrians, that is, people from the region that is now Albania. Roman soldiers crossed the Adriatic Sea and marched directly into mainland Greece. This was also Rome's first military campaign in Greece. In the end, the Illyrians had no choice but to sue for peace with Rome and cede large areas of territory, finally bringing the matter to a close. From then on, Rome had established its own foothold on the Greek peninsula. Now, with security ensured in the south and west, the Gauls to the north were still eager to make a move. The Gauls did not know how to support their growing population by increasing revenue. Whenever famine struck, they would send their army as the vanguard, followed by a mass migration of the entire people. Previously, the Gauls' attacks on Rome had all been repelled, but in 225 BC, this time was different. The Gauls who crossed the Alps had also formed a confederation, assembling an army of as many as 70,000 to begin their invasion southward. Rome, together with its allied states, organized a legion of more than 50,000 troops to confront them. The size of this force meant that Rome had committed all of its available active troops for that year. The fighting between the two sides was exceptionally fierce, but Rome still emerged victorious. Just like before, the Gaulish army was extremely ferocious at the start of the battle, but as time went on, they couldn't hold out. In this battle, more than 40,000 Gaulish soldiers were killed, over 10,000 were captured, and the rest fled north of the Po River. A year later, the two Roman consuls once again led 4 legions northward, crossing the Rubicon River to continue their campaign against the Gauls. Although the Gauls regrouped and brought in reinforcements who had crossed the Alps, they still could not defeat the Romans. In the end, Rome even occupied the Gauls' stronghold south of the Alps, which is the area around present-day Milan. During this battle, a Gallic tribal chief even challenged the two Roman consuls to single combat, and the victor was the 48-year-old Roman consul Marcellus. Because of this episode, many years later during the war with Hannibal, Marcellus was honored with the title Sword of Italy. Overall, in the 3 years following the end of the First Punic War, Rome was extremely busy. They established the provincial system in Sicily, humbly learned from Greek culture, resolved the problem of pirates from the Greek peninsula, defeated the Gauls who had marched south, and carried out a subtle reform that expanded the ranks of the middle class, making Rome's system even more refined. At this time, Hannibal had already ignited the Second Punic War. Hannibal is one of the 4 greatest military commanders in European history, the other 3 being Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Napoleon. Hannibal's feat of leading his army across the Alps to invade the Italian peninsula is truly considered an ancient military miracle. He is also hailed by many military scholars as the father of strategy. During the First Punic War, Hannibal was still a child. He personally witnessed Carthage's defeat at the hands of Rome. However, shortly after the peace treaty was signed, Rome broke the agreement and seized the important islands of Corsica and Sardinia from Carthage. Later, under the pretext of eradicating pirates, Rome invaded Spain from the north. As a result, Therefore, when Hannibal was 9 years old, he swore that he would be an enemy of Rome for his entire life. In 219 BC, Hannibal had grown into a 28-year-old young man, and it was time to fulfill the vow he made in his youth. He first launched an attack on the city of Saguntum, located on the eastern coast of Spain. The location of Saguntum was quite awkward. The treaty between Rome and Carthage clearly stated that Carthaginian expansion in Spain was not to cross north of the Ebro River. Saguntum was situated south of the Ebro River, but it happened to be an ally of Rome. Perhaps because the city was too small, Rome had overlooked it when the treaty was signed. Hannibal was now attacking cities south of the Ebro River, so he claimed that he was not violating the treaty. The besieged Saguntum urgently sent envoys to Rome to ask for help. Rome would never stand by while an allied city was bullied, but at that moment, Rome was entangled with the Gauls to the north and simply did not have the resources to launch an expedition to Spain. Therefore, Rome decided to resolve the Saguntum issue through diplomatic means. Hannibal did not give a direct answer to the Roman envoys. Instead, he even threatened them, saying, "If you continue to linger here and refuse to leave, I can't guarantee that my bloodthirsty soldiers won't harm you." The Roman envoys then went to Carthage in North Africa to lodge a strong protest against Hannibal's actions. However, Hannibal had already sent messengers to collude with the Carthaginian homeland in advance, so the Roman envoys still did not receive a satisfactory response. After deliberation, the Senate once again sent a prestigious delegation to Carthage to protest, but the protest was still ineffective. In this way, 8 months passed, Saguntum fell, and all the surviving residents were enslaved. Hannibal also shared a portion of the spoils gained from Saguntum with the Carthaginian homeland. When Rome learned of this, they finally decided to declare war on Hannibal. Many historians believe that although Hannibal was regarded as the most outstanding tactician of that era, his expertise was limited to large-scale battles. He was not skilled at siege warfare. Because Saguntum was a very small city, yet Hannibal spent 8 months capturing it. But perhaps Hannibal was deliberately stalling for time, forcing Rome to declare war on him first, so that he would not be violating the treaty and could justifiably invade Rome. In May of 218 BC, the 29-year-old Hannibal assembled his army, marking the beginning of the Second Punic War. Hannibal's remarkable feat of leading his army and war elephants across the Alps is well known, even to those who aren't interested in history. But everyone is curious. Why did Hannibal choose such a difficult route for his march? Perhaps Hannibal had no other choice, because the First Punic War had already proven that it was impossible to defeat Rome by fighting outside of Italy. To win, the battlefield had to be in Rome's own heartland. Except for the north, Rome was surrounded by vast strategic buffer zones. Sicily to the south, the islands of Corsica and Sardinia to the west, and Roman territories on the Greek peninsula to the east. That left only the north as an option. Since the Gauls were able to cross the Alps and migrate south, then he believed he could certainly lead his army across as well. Moreover, the Gauls had always been enemies of Rome, so by going there, he could win them over and join forces against Rome. However, Hannibal was not an idealist. He had long anticipated the difficulties and dangers of this journey, so he made extremely thorough preparations. His preparation was to sacrifice the lives of tens of thousands of mercenaries along the way. Hannibal assembled 100,000 mercenaries and 37 elephants, setting out from Spain with the intention of crossing the Alps and striking at Rome's homeland from northern Italy. But shortly after the army set out, it mysteriously disappeared. Upon hearing this news, Rome was thrown into complete panic. They didn't even know where the enemy was. How could they possibly fight this war? How should this battle be fought? In fact, before setting out, Hannibal not only led his own army of 100, but also sent 20 soldiers to Carthage in Africa. This was to guard against a Roman attack on Africa while he was away on his expedition. He also left more than 10 soldiers in Spain, because Spain was actually his true base of operations. On the other hand, when Rome learned that Hannibal had already set out with his troops, they were extremely shocked. Although it was Rome that had declared war on Hannibal, they hadn't expected him to act so quickly. As a result, they urgently redeployed 4 legions that had been confronting the Gauls in northern Italy. The 2 consuls each led 2 legions, one advanced towards Sicily, while the other marched towards Spain. This was because the Romans believed that the upcoming battles would definitely take place in Sicily and Spain. As for dealing with the Gauls, they could only reorganize and form 2 new legions. However, when the consul Sempronius arrived in Sicily, he found that Carthage's African homeland was calm and peaceful. Although there were 20,000 mercenaries, they were just wandering the streets with no sign of preparing for battle. Nevertheless, he still ordered the soldiers to stay on high alert and to strengthen the patrols along the Sicilian coast. The other consul, Cornelius, who was heading to Spain, had already arrived in Massilia with his fleet. Incidentally, Cornelius's son would later become Scipio Africanus, the man who defeated Hannibal. However, the news he received was that Hannibal had actually crossed the Pyrenees Mountains and then mysteriously disappeared. Previously, Rome believed that Hannibal was amassing his army in order to dominate the whole of Spain, but now they couldn't understand what Hannibal's real intentions were with this move. Cornelius dispatched 300 cavalrymen to search for Hannibal's army, while the main force waited on standby in Massilia before the enemy was found. In fact, Hannibal deliberately made himself disappear so that the enemy couldn't figure out his true intentions. Only by catching the enemy completely unprepared could he achieve the effect of a surprise attack. Before crossing the Pyrenees Mountains, he also left more than 10,000 soldiers behind to guard the area, because once they ventured deep into enemy territory, the supply of provisions would become the biggest challenge. Therefore, it was essential to leave troops to secure this crucial supply route. Moreover, he generously announced that any soldiers unwilling to march to the distant land of Italy could withdraw now. So after he crossed the Pyrenees Mountains, his force of 100,000 was reduced to just 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 elephants. Essentially, the army was cut in half. After crossing the Pyrenees, they entered the region of France, which at that time was known as Gaul. More than 2,000 years ago, that area was not endless farmland, but rather dense forests and vast swamps, so even an army of 50,000 marching through would not kick up any dust. Additionally, Hannibal deliberately took a wide detour inland to avoid the Roman allied cities along the coast, and this is why Hannibal's army seemed to disappear. As Hannibal advanced, he came upon the Rhone River blocking his path. On the opposite bank were the watchful Gauls, and just 150 kilometers downstream was Massalia, where the Roman army was stationed. Hannibal first ordered a cavalry unit to circle upstream and deal with the Gauls on the opposite bank, then sent 500 cavalrymen downstream to scout the area. Only then did he give the order for the main army to cross the river. Over 50,000 soldiers and horses needed to cross, along with supply wagons and elephants. The difficulty of this task is easy to imagine. Fortunately, the one thing this area had in abundance was trees. First, they built 2 fences upstream and downstream to slow the current, and then constructed rafts to cross the river. Even so, after the crossing was completed, only 0 of the original 59, 0 troops remained. Just crossing the river cost them 0 men, but Hannibal was not the least bit flustered. This was all within his expectations. In addition, 500 cavalry who went to patrol downstream encountered 300 Roman cavalry sent out to scout, and the 2 sides clashed. From this point on, Rome finally gained knowledge of the whereabouts of Hannibal's main army. When Consul Cornelius arrived, he learned that Hannibal had crossed the river 3 days earlier and was relentlessly advancing toward the Alps. It suddenly dawned on Cornelius, and he finally understood Hannibal's true intentions. It turned out that Hannibal intended to cross the Alps and attack Rome from northern Italy. But understanding this was useless, because most of his troops were infantry, and there was no way they could catch up after 3 days of marching. Now Cornelius was faced with a difficult choice. One option was to lead his troops back to Rome himself to confront Hannibal as he descended from the Alps. However, the 2 legions he had with him totaled just over 20,000 men, and along the way he had already dispatched many soldiers to fend off the nearby Gauls, so he was short on manpower. The other option was to march directly into Spain and destroy Hannibal's main base, while letting the consul Sempronius in Sicily return to deal with Hannibal. But Sempronius was at the southernmost tip of Sicily, and from there to return north to the Alps was simply too far. Judging by the time required, it was clearly impossible to make it in time. Moreover, there was no way to know whether Carthage in Africa would send troops to attack Sicily. So what exactly should he do to resolve this crisis facing Rome? Hannibal is the most formidable general I have ever seen. He led over 100,000 men to march on Rome. After crossing one mountain, only a little over 50,000 remained. Then, after crossing a river, he lost another 13,000. By the time they crossed the Alps and reached Italy, only 26,000 people were left. But Hannibal wasn't the least bit flustered, because from the very beginning, he never intended to bring all those men to Italy. He wanted to use the hardships along the way to filter out only the most elite soldiers. On top of that, since all these men were mercenaries, losing some of them even saved him a portion of their wages. Napoleon also gave a rather objective assessment of Hannibal, saying that the most difficult problem Hannibal faced in crossing the Alps was the herd of elephants. After all, Napoleon himself was someone who had also crossed the Alps. There was another figure as well, Julius Caesar, but unlike Hannibal, he crossed the Alps from the south to the north. But the difficulties Hannibal faced were much greater than those encountered by the other 2. When he first arrived at the foot of the Alps, what affected his army's morale was not the towering mountains ahead, but the hostile Gauls. Hannibal didn't want his army to make unnecessary sacrifices, so he tried his best to win over the Gauls by giving them all kinds of gifts and telling them that he was an enemy of Rome and was merely passing through. Only then was the crisis at the foot of the mountain resolved. Some of the Gallic tribal chiefs even brought fur cloaks to Hannibal so that his army could withstand the cold in the mountains. There were also enthusiastic Gauls who guided Hannibal along the route. Hannibal had 30 elephants march at the very front of the column because these elephants looked intimidating and could deter the Gauls lurking in the mountains. Hannibal originally had 37 elephants, but unfortunately, 7 of them fell into the water while crossing the Rhone River. Behind the elephants were the supply wagons carrying military provisions and the infantry, with the cavalry serving as the rear guard. As expected, many of the mountain dwellers believed this was an invading force. They threw rocks at the army from the cliffs in the mountains and set up ambushes, shooting arrows as soon as the troops approached. Whenever situations like this arose, Hannibal was always the one at the very front. Although it was September when they ascended the mountain, snowflakes had already begun to fall, and the elephants became restless and uneasy in such conditions. Whenever they encountered danger, they would stop moving, and the infantry had to push the elephants forward. Even more frightening was that there was only a narrow path on the mountain, with a sheer cliff on the other side. Elephants that slipped and supply carts that tipped over, along with the soldiers, would vanish into the valley below instantly. The screams of agony left the soldiers in the rear terrified as well, and along the way.
Subscribe to Animystika not to miss anything. Like and share, and join me right away for a new trip in history.